Meghan is hardly innocent. She's down in the dirt with me, whether she likes it or not.
Before sunrise, the walls of Britain's royal residences had already begun to change. A command issued in silence moved through corridors, galleries, private apartments, and ceremonial rooms like a sealed verdict. Meghan's portrait was not covered, not relocated for restoration, not quietly delayed. It was removed. And at the center of that decision stood King Charles, carrying the weight of a monarchy that had decided memory itself could be rearranged. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat alone with the final inventory list before him, and for several minutes, he did not move. The king had signed many papers in his life, but this one carried a different kind of heaviness. A confidential overnight directive, a private royal instruction sent only to trusted palace staff, had been marked for immediate action across Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Kensington Palace. It was not a request. It was not a review. It was a command. King Charles ordered Meghan's portrait removed from every royal residence overnight, ending its official place within the visible royal family narrative. That mattered because royal residences are not ordinary homes. They are living symbols of power, memory, duty, and belonging. Whoever appears inside them is not just remembered, they are recognized. Meghan heard the news through a private call, and silence took her before anger could. She had lived through headlines, interviews, cold statements, and closed doors. But this felt different because the rejection had become physical. A portrait can hang quietly for years, asking nothing, saying nothing, yet still proving that someone once stood close enough to be framed beside a dynasty. Now that proof was being lifted away, she did not ask twice. She did not demand the caller repeat the words. The Duchess understood that when a palace removes an image overnight, it is not correcting a wall. It is sending a message. A senior aide hesitated before the first frame came down, and that hesitation revealed the truth no one wanted to say aloud. The aide was not moving decoration. He was handling history. The order contained one chilling instruction. No portrait was to remain in public, semi-public, or private ceremonial spaces by morning. Ceremonial spaces are rooms used for official royal moments, where visitors, dignitaries, and family members see the monarchy presenting itself with care. That was why the command struck so deeply. Charles had not chosen a quiet corner. He had chosen every corner. William received the final update after the last frame had already been lifted from the wall. The prince listened without interruption, then gave no sign of surprise. His stillness carried its own confession. He had known this moment was possible. Perhaps he had known it was inevitable. And as the empty spaces settled into the palace before dawn, one truth became impossible to ignore. Meghan's image had vanished, but the wound behind its removal was only beginning to open. Because before the palace could explain why Meghan's image had vanished, the people closest to the decision had to face what each of them stood to lose. A portrait can seem harmless until it becomes a symbol. For Charles, it represented a chapter he could no longer control. For Meghan, it represented the last visible proof that she had once belonged inside those walls. For William, it was a reminder of wounds the palace never fully closed. And for Camilla, watching quietly from the edge of the storm, it became something far more dangerous, a test of loyalty. Charles understood that every royal image carried a message far beyond paint, frame, and placement. The king was not only dealing with a family wound, he was standing at the center of an institution built on signs, symbols, and carefully protected meaning. In the monarchy, nothing inside a royal residence is truly random. A portrait tells visitors who matters, who serves, who belongs, and who still holds a place in the story. That was why Meghan's image had become so difficult for the palace to defend. It had remained in selected residences as part of a broader royal family display, but after years of distance, interviews, accusations, and broken trust, its presence no longer felt neutral. It felt like a question no one wanted to answer. Meghan gripped her phone after the call ended, and the hurt deepened in a way words could not soften. She had already left the working royal world once, but this felt like a second departure, colder and more deliberate. The Duchess had endured separation before, yet this removal reached into memory itself. It said that even the version of her once accepted by the palace could now be taken down before morning. She did not need a public statement to understand the meaning. The silence was loud enough. The empty space spoke with the cruelty of something final. William stood apart after being briefed, choosing silence over satisfaction. The prince could have treated the decision as proof that the palace was finally drawing a line, but he knew the cost of that line. He understood that the family divide had hardened into something more permanent than disagreement. It had become structure. It had become policy. It had become the kind of decision aides could carry out with gloves and inventory sheets, while the people behind the names carried the damage. Camilla noticed something that unsettled her. Charles had not asked for advice before signing the order. The queen consort had watched him wrestle with difficult choices before, but this time the king moved with a private finality that shut everyone out. A note attached to the palace file called Meghan's portrait, an active source of ceremonial contradiction, meaning it created confusion during official royal moments by presenting someone outside active duty as if she still belonged inside the working royal circle. That phrase changed everything. It turned emotion into evidence. It turned a family portrait into a royal problem. Meghan's shock sharpened when she realized this was not a staff decision, not a quiet adjustment, not a mistake hidden behind procedure. It came from Charles himself. And once Meghan understood whose command had removed her image, the question shifted from what happened overnight to what triggered Charles to act with such final force. The order did not appear from nowhere. It was born from one moment the palace could not forget a private charity reception at Windsor, where a guest paused before Meghan's portrait and asked why someone so publicly separated from royal duty still held a place of honor beside working members of the crown. The question was quiet. The damage was immediate. And Charles heard every word of the aftermath. Charles felt the question land before anyone answered it. The king had spent years trying to hold together the emotional pieces of a family that kept breaking in public, but that one sentence turned private pain into an official problem. The Windsor patronage reception incident, as palace staff later called it, was not a grand scandal in the usual sense. It was a private charity gathering where donors, aides, and royal representatives came together under the banner of service. Patronage means official royal support for a charity or cause, and that mattered because the room was filled with portraits of active royal patrons, people still carrying public duties for the crown. Meghan's image, placed near those working figures, suddenly looked less like memory and more like confusion. William understood the danger immediately when Charles later described the moment. The prince did not speak with cruelty, but he spoke with a firmness the monarch could not ignore. He told his father that symbols could not be treated as sentimental leftovers when the monarchy depended on clarity and discipline. Meghan had once represented youth, change, and a new bridge to the wider world, but after years of fracture, the same image now carried another meaning. It reminded people of departure, accusation, and unfinished conflict. That was the bitter contrast. What had once looked like success now felt like suffering, preserved in a frame. Charles stood still after the donor's question, and his expression tightened because the contradiction had finally been spoken aloud. The king could manage headlines, he could survive criticism, but he could not ignore a problem that appeared inside his own walls, in front of people who expected the monarchy to know exactly what it was saying. A palace secretary recorded in a documented account that after the reception, Charles requested a full list of every residence where Meghan's image still appeared. That detail mattered. It showed the moment had moved beyond embarrassment. It had become review, record, and action. The file revealed one troubling fact. Some rooms used for diplomatic and charitable meetings still presented Meghan visually as part of the active royal circle. Diplomatic rooms are spaces where the monarchy receives officials, guests, and representatives from public life, so every image there carries weight. Charles read that line more than once. William's warning echoed behind it. Meghan's name no longer sat quietly in memory. It stood at the center of a decision waiting to happen. Then the monarch summoned a private meeting, and her name was placed at the top of a file marked Residential Representation. That file would soon become the weapon in a confrontation no one inside the palace could soften, delay, or hide. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with Charles closing a folder and looking across the room at William, both men aware that Meghan's portrait had become more than a family matter. It was now a test of authority. No aide spoke, no one interrupted. And when Charles finally explained why the order had to stand, the silence in the room carried years of pain. Charles knew this conversation could not be handled through staff, statements, or carefully written palace language. The king had already made the decision, but now he had to decide whether it would be defended with force or softened, before the world understood its meaning. William sat across from him, calm but tense, aware that the removal had crossed a line the family could never pretend was accidental. They were alone in a small royal study, and that mattered because royal studies are private rooms where monarchs handle sensitive family and state decisions away from official audiences. Without aides present, the meeting stopped being procedure. It became father and son facing the cost of command. William chose his words carefully, because he knew one careless sentence could turn discipline into cruelty. The prince told Charles that leaving Meghan's portraits in place had allowed confusion to survive where the monarchy needed clarity. He did not speak as someone seeking revenge. He spoke as the future king, carrying the pressure of what came next. Meghan's image, he warned, had become a symbol people kept reading in different ways. To some, it was memory. To others, it was contradiction. To the palace, it had become a risk. And risks inside a monarchy do not stay hidden for long. Charles listened with visible strain, and the monarch's answer came slowly. He admitted that removing Meghan's image felt like closing a family door he once hoped could remain slightly open. The king had wanted a space where the past could exist without causing damage, but the past had not stayed quiet. It had followed the family into receptions, briefings, and private conversations. William then revealed the part that made the room colder. Younger staff and visiting officials had begun asking whether royal status could remain visible, even after royal duty had ended. That question struck at the heart of the crown. Charles placed his hand flat on the folder, and his voice hardened. The monarchy, he said, could not display what it no longer represented. Those words turned hesitation into policy. William understood the finality in them, but he also understood the pain beneath them. Later, when Camilla entered and sensed the weight in the room, the queen consort realized this was not merely about Meghan. It was about every royal symbol still carrying unresolved conflict. Every frame that seemed harmless, until it began to challenge authority. But the deeper power behind the order was not emotion alone. It was the brutal machinery of monarchy deciding who belongs on the walls and who disappears from them. Inside the monarchy, power does not always announce itself with speeches. Sometimes it appears as a revised hanging list, a sealed instruction, a corridor left bare before breakfast. Charles had the authority to order the change, but the decision exposed something larger. The royal image is not personal property. It is controlled memory. And once Meghan's portrait became a contradiction, the crown moved to erase that contradiction with precision. Charles understood that the walls of a royal residence were never only walls. The king knew they carried the story the monarchy wanted the world to believe: who served, who endured, who inherited, and who stood close enough to be remembered. Royal residences are curated homes and official spaces where every portrait, chair, document, and display is chosen to express hierarchy, service, legitimacy, and continuity. That mattered because Meghan's image had not been hanging in a private family corner without meaning. It had been part of the monarchy's visible language. And once that language began to confuse duty with memory, the monarch had to decide whether sentiment could survive inside a system built on order. A senior curator held Meghan's portrait in gloved hands. An unease moved through him before the frame was lowered into storage. The curator had handled priceless objects before, but this was different, because the value was not in the material, it was in the message. Official display spaces are rooms controlled by the crown to show royal identity during visits, receptions, ceremonies, and private preparation before public duty. Charles's authority over those spaces gave the order its force. This was not a household adjustment. It was a sovereign decision, the kind of command that turns a quiet change into a royal verdict. Camilla watched Charles from across the room and sensed that something inside him had hardened. The queen consort had seen him hesitate before, especially when family pain stood too close to royal duty. But this time the king left little room for retreat. He did not ask whether the order was kind, he asked whether it was clear. That difference frightened her, because clarity inside the palace often arrived after emotion had already been sacrificed. Meghan's portrait had once represented promise, modernity, and a bridge toward a new royal chapter. Now it had become a reminder of fracture, and the crown was choosing discipline over tenderness. The revised hanging list revealed the full scale of the decision. Meghan's portrait was not simply removed from public galleries. It was also taken from private ceremonial rooms used before major royal events, where family members gather before stepping into official roles. Then came the replacement order. Portraits of working royals and direct heirs were quietly placed where her image had once remained, turning absence into a statement of succession, service, and control. The machinery moved with chilling efficiency. But efficiency could not soften what came next. Because the moment Meghan heard how empty spaces had replaced her, the fallout moved from palace walls into human hearts, private calls, and irreversible silence. By morning, nothing looked violent. No windows were broken. No gates were stormed. No official announcement thundered across the nation. Yet inside the family, the damage was unmistakable. A portrait had disappeared, and with it went the last soft illusion that Meghan might still be represented inside royal life. The palace had not shouted. It had done something colder. It had made absence official. Meghan sat alone after the call ended, and the quiet around her felt heavier than any public insult. The Duchess had survived storms before, but this wound carried a different kind of force because it came without noise, without explanation, without even the mercy of a direct conversation. Across the royal residences, staff had already confirmed the order was complete before public visitors, invited guests, or scheduled meetings could begin. Royal residences are not just family homes. They are official spaces where the monarchy presents its values, its history, and its chosen faces. That was why the timing mattered. By completing the removals before morning, the palace made sure no one inside those walls could pretend the decision was still being debated. Harry entered and saw Meghan's expression before she spoke. The prince had known anger, exile, and public rejection, but this silence unsettled him because it looked like something deeper than shock. It looked like the moment a person realizes they have not just been criticized, but symbolically erased. The palace began preparing neutral language for anyone who asked, careful phrases about updated displays and reviewed household presentation. Yet everyone close to the matter understood the truth. This removal carried a personal and political message. It told Meghan that her place in the royal story would no longer be protected by memory, and it told the world that the crown was ready to redraw its own image with a colder hand. Meghan received a private message from a former palace contact, and the detail inside it changed everything. The removals had been synchronized overnight. They had not happened gradually. They had not been left to individual houses or quiet judgment. They had moved together, residence by residence, like a single decision with a single source. Harry stiffened when he heard it, because synchronization meant intention. It meant planning. It meant the palace had not simply taken down a portrait. It had coordinated absence. Meghan then learned that even residences with no public access had been included, and that revelation cut through every possible excuse. If the order had only touched public galleries, the palace could have called it optics. But private spaces proved it was principle. Harry prepared to confront the decision emotionally, ready to answer pain with fire, but Meghan did not follow him into fury. She stayed quiet. She weighed the emptiness differently. For the first time, Meghan does not reach for outrage first. She reaches for meaning, and that choice changes the emotional direction of the entire crisis. The turning point arrives not in a palace briefing, but in a private conversation between Meghan and Harry, with no advisors, no statements, and no strategy papers between them. He expects fury. He expects a demand to fight back. Instead, Meghan speaks with a sadness that unsettles him more than anger ever could. She says the portrait was never the point. The point was whether they still needed the wall. Harry paced because stillness felt impossible. The prince had listened to every detail of the overnight removal, and each one struck him like another locked door. Meghan remained seated, and her quietness made the room feel even heavier. She was not performing pain. She was not building a response. She was facing the truth beneath the insult. The palace had removed her image from royal residences, but the deeper question was whether she and Harry would keep measuring their worth by spaces that no longer welcomed them. That mattered, because royal representation is more than public display. It is the palace's way of saying who belongs inside the official story. When that representation is withdrawn, the wound reaches beyond pride. It reaches into identity. Meghan looked at Harry and told him that if the palace wanted the walls cleared, then their future could not depend on being seen inside those walls. The words stopped him. He had expected anger, a plan, maybe even a demand that Charles be confronted directly. Instead, the Duchess offered something colder and stronger: release. She was not asking to be restored. She was not asking to be defended as a portrait, a title, or a symbol. She was choosing emotional separation over symbolic pleading. That choice mattered, because humiliation feeds on the hope of being invited back. Meghan was refusing to let the empty space become a cage. Harry understood then that the decision had changed shape. The removal no longer belonged only to Charles, William, Camilla, or palace officials. It now belonged to Meghan too, because she could decide what meaning it carried. The prince watched her reach for an old framed photograph from a royal event, a reminder of a chapter that once promised success, applause, and acceptance. She removed it from its place without bitterness. That gesture was not surrender, it was control. It was the quiet act of someone deciding that memory could be kept without needing permission from the institution that once displayed it. Meghan did not deny the hurt, and Harry did not deny the anger still rising inside him. But something had shifted between them. The palace had chosen absence as punishment. She was turning absence into freedom. The contrast was sharp. The crown had cleared walls to protect its image, while Meghan cleared a private space to protect her peace. That private decision prepared both of them for the public storm waiting beyond the door, because once the world discovered what had happened overnight, every empty frame would become a headline, every silence would become a signal, and when the missing portraits became a public story, the monarchy learned that silence can sometimes speak louder than any palace statement. The story breaks not through an announcement, but through an image. A morning newspaper front page showing a polished royal corridor, with one pale rectangle on the wall, where Meghan's portrait had once hung. The headline is merciless, erased by dawn. By breakfast, broadcasters are dissecting the empty space, as though it were a royal speech. And outside Windsor, the public begins gathering to stare at gates that reveal nothing. Charles watched the coverage without speaking, and the silence around him grew heavier with every repeated image. The king had expected questions, but he had not expected the empty space to become more powerful than the portrait itself. Public reaction began the moment absence became visible. What had been a private palace order was now a national talking point, and that mattered, because the monarchy survives not only through rules, but through what people believe those rules mean. One missing frame had turned into a public verdict. Some saw discipline. Some saw cruelty. Everyone saw intention. Meghan saw the erased by dawn front page and closed the tablet gently. The Duchess refused to let the headline decide her dignity for her. She had already made her private choice with Harry, and now the world was trying to drag that quiet decision into noise. The palace response remained controlled, almost cold, describing the change as part of an updated residential display policy. A residential display policy is the official guidance for what images, objects, and symbols appear inside royal homes and ceremonial rooms. The phrase sounded harmless, but its meaning was sharp. It allowed the palace to speak about removal without saying rejection. Harry heard the broadcasters repeat the story, and anger moved through him again, not because the public knew, but because the palace language made the wound sound administrative. One commentator framed the removal as the clearest visual boundary yet between royal blood, royal duty, and royal memory. That line spread quickly because it captured what the palace could not admit. Meghan was still tied to the family by history, marriage, and children, but the institution was drawing a harder line around duty. The difference between belonging to a family and belonging to the crown had never looked more brutal. Outside Windsor Castle, a small crowd gathered near the gates, some calling the order cruel, others calling it overdue. Windsor Castle matters because it is one of the monarchy's most recognizable homes, a place where private family history and public royal power constantly meet. That was why the gathering felt so charged. People were not only reacting to a portrait, they were reacting to what removal said about forgiveness, status, exile, and control. Charles listened as aides prepared briefings, but his attention stayed fixed on the emotional cost now spreading beyond palace walls. The debate reached its peak as the monarch prepared a final internal statement for senior staff, one that would define how the family understood what had happened. Meghan held her silence. Harry held his anger. Charles held the burden of command. But after the headlines, the crowds, and the shock faded, one truth remained for Charles, Meghan, Harry, and the monarchy itself. In the end, the removal was not simply about a portrait. It was about belonging, duty, memory, and the painful moment when a family decides that love and representation are no longer the same thing. Charles did not just clear a wall. Meghan did not just lose a frame. Harry did not just witness another rejection. The monarchy declared that its symbols would now follow service, not sentiment. Charles returned to the corridor after the storm had passed, and the empty space seemed to answer him before anyone else could. The king had faced anger, headlines, and the silent judgment of those who believed the decision had gone too far. But now there was only the result. Meghan's portrait was gone. The wall no longer carried the image of someone whose royal role had become impossible to define. That mattered because a royal residence is not simply a place where a family lives. It is a public symbol of what the crown chooses to honor, protect, and present as part of its official story. By removing the frame, Charles separated personal history from official royal representation, and that separation became the real verdict. Meghan reached her own conclusion far from the palace walls, and she did not reach it as someone begging to be restored. The Duchess understood the pain, but she also understood the strange freedom hidden inside it. If her image could be removed overnight, then her peace could no longer depend on being displayed by the same institution that had wounded her. Harry saw that truth slowly, and the prince felt the finality of it settle inside him. The monarchy had closed the visual door, but that closure also ended the uncertainty that had kept old wounds alive. It was brutal, it was clear, and in its own painful way, it was complete. William recognized what the order had created. The prince saw that the palace walls would no longer preserve unresolved relationships for the sake of appearances. The crown is the institution of monarchy itself, the official power, duty, and identity that continues beyond any one family argument. And Charles had chosen its clarity over emotional ambiguity. That choice cost him something personal, because the king knew the removal would be remembered not as decoration changed, but as belonging withdrawn. Yet leadership sometimes leaves no gentle option. Sometimes the crown demands discipline where the heart still searches for mercy. Meghan chose dignity outside the frame. Harry confronted the finality of separation. William accepted the new standard that symbols must match service. Charles carried the burden of the decision as monarch and father, knowing both roles could not be satisfied at once. The moment meant the monarchy had finally admitted what it had avoided for years. Memory could remain, love could still ache, but official representation had to follow duty. The palace had not erased the past. It had drawn a border around the future. The verdict was final. Meghan's portrait vanished from the royal residences, but the empty space it left behind became the clearest portrait of the monarchy's new reality. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.